This isn't a market move, it's a monetary rupture. What you're watching right now isn't normal price discovery, it's real assets ripping away from the currency that's supposed to price them. Gold and silver aren't rising because demand is hot. They're repricing because trust in paper is failing. That distinction matters because bull markets climb, resets gap, when investors stop asking what something is worth and start asking what will still hold value, behavior changes instantly. Yield stops mattering, timing stops mattering, shelter becomes the only objective. And this hits you whether you're prepared or not, because when a currency loses credibility, everything built on it starts wobbling. Savings, debt, salaries, contracts. The system doesn't collapse politely. It forces adjustments. Here's the contradiction driving this moment. The system needs more debt to function. But every new layer of debt accelerates the loss of confidence that makes the system unstable. Once that loop becomes obvious, capital doesn't rotate. It evacuates. And when that evacuation becomes visible to everyone else, calm decision-making is already off the table. What makes this phase dangerous is how quickly confidence flips. The trigger isn't one headline or one announcement. It's the bond market starting to malfunction. At the same time, capital is trying to escape when long-term yields rise despite intervention. That's not tightening. That's fear of solvency. It tells you the market isn't worried about growth anymore. It's worried about getting paid back. And this pressure isn't coming from nowhere. One of the largest sources of global liquidity is being pulled home. Capital that used to suppress borrowing costs abroad is being repatriated to deal with stress at home. When that happens, the US loses a critical buyer right when it needs one the most. Here's the reframing question most people miss. What happens when the market stops responding to policy and starts responding to balance sheet risk? Because at that point, rate cuts don't calm anything. They confirm the fear. The only remaining response becomes liquidity, printing, expansion, and every time that lever gets pulled, the currency weakens further, pushing more capital into hard assets. This is the feedback loop. Rising yields increase deficits. Deficits demand more currency creation, and currency creation destroys the confidence needed to stabilize yields. Once that loop starts feeding on itself, exits get crowded fast. There's a claim forming underneath all this price action that explains why the moves feel so violent. This isn't speculation. It's a system reacting to insolvency risk. Look at the behavior, not the commentary. Bond markets aren't absorbing supply the way they used to. Long-term yields push higher, even as officials signal accommodation. That shouldn't happen in a controlled environment. It happens when buyers start questioning the safety of the instrument itself. Now separate fact from inference. Fact, real assets are accelerating while financial promises wobble. Fact, traditional stabilizers are failing to stabilize. Inference, confidence in paper claims is being repriced downward fast. Notice what's missing from reassurance. There's no credible plan to restore trust through discipline. No roadmap back to a world where holding sovereign debt feels unquestionably safe. Just emergency language and temporary measures stretch longer each time. This is where perception flips permanently. When markets stop believing that control is possible, prices stop waiting for permission. Dollar-based valuations lose authority. They become trailing indicators, not anchors. Here's the line that changes everything. When capital starts moving to avoid being trapped, it doesn't move carefully. It moves decisively. And once that shift takes hold, volatility isn't the exception. It's the signal. Now watch how this spills out of finance and into geopolitics. When currency credibility cracks, cooperation doesn't survive. Trade stops being neutral. It becomes leverage. Tariffs replace agreements. Access replaces trust. And policy shifts from protecting stability to protecting advantage. You can see the turn clearly. The language moves away from a strong currency toward domestic competitiveness. Participation in the system gets priced. Outsiders get penalized. and the idea of synchronized global policy quietly dissolves. This is where the story flips. Monetary stress doesn't stay technical. It becomes strategic. Central banks stop acting like referees and start acting like extensions of national power. Independence fades, alignment hardens. Here's why that matters. Once currency weakness becomes a tool instead of a problem, the response set changes completely. Inflation is tolerated, asset prices are allowed to run, and the costs are pushed outward onto whoever holds the paper last. The market hasn't fully priced what happens when trade rules, currency policy, and political timing converge. Because when they do, adjustments don't glide, they jump. What comes next isn't financial, it's territorial. When trust in paper breaks down, governments stop relying on markets to supply what they need. They start securing it directly. Resources shift from being traded to being controlled, and mining stops being an industry and starts being strategy. You can see the change in posture. Projects that sat dormant for years suddenly get fast-tracked. Regions once treated as politically sensitive become economically urgent. Deposits of gold, silver, and copper are no longer evaluated by return on investment, but by strategic necessity. Here's why that changes the game. When supply becomes political, price loses its power to balance the market. Higher prices don't bring relief. They expose how little flexibility is left. And once multiple states compete for the same physical inputs, scarcity becomes permanent, not cyclical. This is where repricing stops being emotional and becomes structural. Supply can't respond fast enough. New mines take years. Infrastructure takes longer. And decisions made under stress don't get reversed easily. When resources are treated as security assets instead of commodities, volatility isn't a temporary phase. It becomes the operating environment. Here's where the internal mechanics finally explain the chaos on the surface. Silver isn't tight because demand suddenly exploded. It's tight because supply cannot respond. Most silver doesn't come from primary silver mines. It comes as a byproduct of other metals. That means higher prices don't unlock new supply the way people expect. Production decisions are tied to copper, zinc, and lead, not silver itself. At the same time, demand doesn't bend. Energy systems, electronics, defense platforms, and infrastructure require fixed amounts of silver. They don't pause when prices rise, they absorb the cost because failure isn't an option. That creates a structural deficit that price alone cannot fix. This is where the paper system starts breaking. Futures markets assume most contracts will never ask for delivery. That assumption is failing. When large players demand physical metal instead of settlement, inventories drain fast, delays appear, rules get adjusted, confidence starts to crack. Notice the shift. Price stops being the signal. Availability becomes the signal. The quoted number matters less than whether metal can actually be sourced. Once too many claims chase too little metal, suppression doesn't unwind gradually. It snaps. Now look at who's moving first, because it tells you where this ends. This isn't retail speculation chasing headlines. It's institutions rejecting leverage. Large players are no longer satisfied with paper exposure. They're standing for delivery, pulling metal out of the system, treating possession as more important than price. When that behavior shows up at scale, exchanges don't just get stressed. They get exposed. Settlement timelines stretch. Inventories thin out. Rules quietly change to discourage delivery. Margins rise. Access tightens. All of it points to the same reality. The system was never designed for this many participants to demand the same thing at once. Here's the line that reframes everything. When availability matters more than profit, the market stops functioning as a market. It becomes a queue, and queues create feedback loops. Every ounce removed makes the next ounce more valuable. Every delivery tightens confidence further. Every adjustment meant to stabilize confirms the fear driving the behavior. This is how runs begin. Not with panic, with preference. Preference for certainty over promises. And once that preference spreads, it doesn't reverse calmly. It accelerates. The fracture widens when pricing power shifts away from screens and toward possession. The center of gravity moves east, not symbolically but physically. Metal flows to where delivery is prioritized and hoarding is policy. Premiums appear that never close, not because of inefficiency, but because governments decide who can move material and who can't. Arbitrage fails, logistics harden, and suddenly there isn't one global price anymore. This is where the system-level insight matters. When physical markets and paper markets diverge, the paper side doesn't get a vote. It loses supply. Every ounce pulled out of Western vaults tightens the system further, while quoted prices lag behind reality. At the same time, metals are being reclassified. No longer just inputs or investments, they're labeled critical, strategic, essential. That designation removes them from normal circulation and places them behind national priorities. Stockpiling replaces trading, access replaces liquidity. Here's the unsettling truth. Once governments treat a material as security infrastructure, free markets stop clearing it efficiently. Scarcity stops being cyclical. It becomes engineered. And when engineered scarcity meets financial leverage, repricing doesn't follow models. It follows necessity. At this stage, the market loses its natural brakes. Industrial demand doesn't negotiate with price. Silver sits inside electronics, energy systems, medical equipment, and military hardware in amounts that are non-optional. Even dramatic price increases barely register compared to the cost of stopping production. So demand doesn't fall as prices rise, it hardens. That's the structural difference most people miss. In past squeezes, buyers backed off, speculators took profits, pressure released. Here the buyers that matter can't step away. Designs are locked, supply chains are fixed, substitution takes years, not quarters, and often isn't technically viable. This creates a floor that speculation can't break. Price spikes don't kill demand, they expose how dependent the system already is. And once industrial buyers accept higher prices as a survival cost, rallies stop exhausting themselves naturally. Here's the key shift. When demand becomes price insensitive, markets stop cycling. They reset upward and stay there until supply structurally changes. And in this system, supply can't move fast enough, which means the final adjustment doesn't come from enthusiasm fading, it comes from the system conceding. Here's how the arc closes. This isn't a spike that fades or a bubble that bursts. It's a transfer. A system built on paper claims is being forced to reconcile with physical limits, and that reconciliation always moves value in one direction, away from promises toward possession. When paper and physical finally decouple, there's no reset button. New price levels don't drift back to old comfort zones. They establish a new baseline. History shows that once metals re-anchor a monetary system at higher levels, they don't give it back. They become reference points for what came after. That's why timing becomes a distraction at the end. The question stops being whether prices are high. It becomes whether access still exists. By the time that distinction is obvious to everyone, the transfer is already underway. This story doesn't resolve with a single announcement or a clean date on a calendar. It unfolds through stress, adaptation, and forced repricing. Quietly at first, then unmistakably. If you want to stay ahead of what's forming beneath the noise, follow and subscribe. The next phase won't arrive with clarity or warning. It will only make sense once it's already happened.